Margaret Thornton had always imagined her daughter's wedding day would be one of the proudest moments of her life. She'd pictured herself in a tasteful mother-of-the-bride dress, perhaps something in champagne or soft blue, dabbing at happy tears as Emma walked down the aisle. She'd envisioned helping with the seating arrangements, offering sage advice about flower choices, and standing beside her daughter as she took this momentous step into married life. What Margaret had never imagined, not in her wildest nightmares, was sitting across from Emma and her fiancé, Bradley, in their cramped London flat, hearing the words that would shatter everything. "We don't want you at the wedding." Emma's voice was steady, rehearsed even, as though she'd practiced this speech multiple times in front of the mirror. Bradley sat beside her, his hand protectively covering hers, his expression a mixture of defiance and discomfort. Margaret felt her husband Thomas stiffen beside her on the small sofa. The autumn rain pattered against the windows of the Shoreditch apartment, filling the stunned silence that followed Emma's declaration. "I beg your pardon," Thomas said finally, his naturally refined voice tight with controlled emotion. "You heard me, Dad?" Emma lifted her chin, a gesture Margaret recognized from Emma's childhood. It was what she did when she was frightened but determined not to show it. "Bradley and I have discussed this at length. We think it's best if you and Mum don't attend the ceremony." Margaret's mind reeled. "Emma, darling, I don't understand. Have we done something wrong?" "It's not about one thing," Emma said, and Margaret caught the slight tremor beneath the brave facade. "It's about everything. It's about years of control and expectations and judgment." "Control?" Thomas's voice rose slightly. "We've supported you through university, helped you with the deposit on this flat, paid for your—" "Exactly," Emma interrupted, her composure cracking. "Everything always comes with strings attached. You paid for my education, so I had to study law instead of art. You helped with the flat, so you get to comment on every decision Bradley and I make. You've offered to contribute to the wedding, so now you think you can dictate the guest list, the venue, the menu." "We've only made suggestions," Margaret protested, feeling heat rise to her cheeks. "Darling, we were simply trying to help. Your father and I have more experience with these things." "And there it is again." Bradley spoke for the first time, his Yorkshire accent seeming more pronounced in contrast to the Thorntons' received pronunciation. "You two always know better. Emma's never good enough, never making the right choices." Thomas stood abruptly. "Now see here, young man." "Dad, please sit down," Emma's voice cracked. "This is hard enough as it is." Margaret reached for her husband's hand, gently pulling him back to the sofa. Her heart hammered in her chest. This couldn't be happening, not to their family. They were close, weren't they? They talked every week, saw each other regularly. Or did they? Margaret tried to remember the last time they'd had a conversation with Emma that hadn't involved some critique or advice. When had they last simply listened? "Emma," Margaret said carefully, "if we've been overbearing, we can change. Your father and I only want what's best for you. We can step back more, let you make your own decisions." "It's too late for that," Emma said, and Margaret heard the finality in her tone. "Bradley and I want to start our marriage on our own terms. We want a wedding day that's about us, not about meeting your expectations or avoiding your disappointment." "So your solution is to exclude your own parents?" Thomas's voice was thick with hurt. "Emma, we raised you better than this." "Did you?" Emma stood now too, her eyes glistening. "Or did you raise me to be obedient and compliant and terrified of letting you down? Do you know how exhausting it is, always trying to be the daughter you want instead of the person I am?" Margaret felt tears burning behind her eyes. "We've always loved you exactly as you are." "No, Mum," Emma shook her head. "You've loved the version of me that fits your image, the straight-A student, the law firm associate. But when I wanted to take a pottery class, you said it was frivolous. When I mentioned possibly working for a nonprofit, Dad said I'd be wasting my potential. When I brought Bradley home," her voice caught, "you couldn't hide your disappointment that he wasn't from your world." Bradley squeezed Emma's hand. Margaret noticed the protective gesture and felt a pang of something uncomfortably close to shame. It was true that she and Thomas had initially been less than enthusiastic about their daughter's relationship with a plumber from Leeds. They'd never said anything overtly critical, of course. They were too well-bred for that. But their lukewarm politeness, their failure to invite him to family gatherings, their subtle suggestions that Emma was settling, none of that had gone unnoticed. "We've treated Bradley perfectly civilly," Thomas said stiffly. "Civilly?" Bradley repeated the word with a bitter laugh. "That's exactly the problem, isn't it? Everything's always civil and proper and polite, but underneath there's this constant current of disapproval." "If you felt unwelcome," Margaret began. This isn't about how I feel, Bradley cut her off, though not unkindly. It's about how Emma feels. She spent her whole life trying to earn your approval, and it's never enough, and I'll be damned if I let that continue into our marriage. Thomas pulled his hand away from Margaret's. I see, so this is your doing. You're driving a wedge between Emma and her family. Dad, stop! Emma's voice was sharp. This is my decision. Bradley supports me, but this is what I want. I need space from you both. I need to figure out who I am without your voices in my head, constantly judging every choice I make. Margaret felt as though the floor had dropped away beneath her. How had it come to this? Yes, she'd had opinions about Emma's life choices. What mother didn't? But she'd always thought she was being helpful, guiding her daughter toward success and happiness. Had she really been so blind to Emma's feelings? The wedding is in 3 months, Emma continued, her voice steadier now. We're having a small ceremony, just close friends. We'll send you photographs afterward if you'd like. If we'd like, Thomas's face had gone red. Emma, this is outrageous. We're your parents. We have every right to be at your wedding. You have no rights where my life is concerned, Emma said quietly. Not anymore. I'm an adult. I get to choose who I want in my life and on what terms. Margaret watched her daughter's face, so familiar yet in this moment seeming like a stranger's. Emma had Thomas's strong jawline, Margaret's gray-green eyes. She'd been such a lovely child, eager to please, always bringing home certificates and awards. When had that sweet girl become this hardened woman, building walls instead of bridges? But even as the thought formed, Margaret knew it was unfair. Emma wasn't the one who'd changed. Perhaps she'd simply stopped pretending. Please, Margaret tried once more, her voice breaking. Don't do this. Let's talk, properly talk. We can work through this. We tried to talk, Emma said, and there was a weariness in her voice that made Margaret's heart ache. I've tried to set boundaries for years. I've asked you to stop criticizing my choices, to accept Bradley, to respect my decisions. But you never listen. You just steamroll over everything with your suggestions and concerns and experience. Thomas stood again, his movements stiff with dignity and wounded pride. If that's how you feel, then perhaps it's best we leave. Thomas, Margaret started. No, Margaret? He looked down at her, his expression closed off in that way he had when he was deeply hurt. Our daughter has made her feelings quite clear. We're not wanted. There's no point prolonging this conversation. Margaret rose slowly, her legs feeling unsteady. She looked at Emma, really looked at her, and saw for the first time the toll this confrontation had taken. Her daughter's hands trembled despite Bradley's support. There were shadows under her eyes, and the brittleness in her voice suggested she was moments away from breaking down entirely. Emma, Margaret said softly, I want you to know that regardless of what happens between us, I love you. I will always love you. Emma's face crumpled slightly before she regained control. I know you do, Mum, but love isn't enough when it comes with conditions. There are no conditions. There are always conditions with you and Dad. We love you, but you should be a lawyer. We love you, but you could do better than Bradley. We love you, but why can't you be more like the daughter we imagined? Thomas moved toward the door. Come along, Margaret, we've imposed on these young people long enough. The walk from Emma's flat to their car felt like miles, though it was only down 2 flights of stairs and across a small courtyard. The rain had intensified, cold drops mixing with the tears that Margaret could no longer hold back. Thomas walked slightly ahead, his shoulders rigid, refusing to acknowledge his own pain. They drove back to Hampshire in silence, the motorway lights blurring past in the gathering dusk. Margaret stared out the window, replaying the conversation in her mind, searching for the moment where it all went wrong. But she couldn't identify a single point of failure. Instead, she saw a pattern stretching back years, 1,000 small moments where she'd offered helpful advice instead of unconditional acceptance, where she'd prioritized her vision of Emma's future over Emma's own desires. By the time they reached their house, a lovely Georgian property they'd scrimped and saved for, wanting to provide the best life possible for their daughter, it was fully dark. Thomas went straight to his study without a word. Margaret stood in the hallway, listening to the grandfather clock tick, feeling utterly lost in her own home. Over the next few days, Margaret and Thomas moved around each other like ghosts, neither one willing to address the elephant in the room. Thomas threw himself into work, staying late at the office and coming home exhausted. Margaret went through the motions of her daily routine, her book club, her committee meetings, her bridge games, but everything felt hollow and pointless. At her book club meeting, surrounded by women she'd known for 20 years, Margaret found herself only half listening to the discussion of the latest literary prize winner. Instead, she studied her friends' faces, wondering if any of them had experienced what she was going through. Had any of them been uninvited from their children's lives? Margaret, what do you think? She startled, realizing Pauline had asked her a question. I'm sorry, I was miles away. We were discussing the mother-daughter relationship in the novel, Pauline said gently, her eyes concerned. Are you all right? You seem distracted. Margaret opened her mouth to deflect with a polite lie, but instead found herself saying, Emma's getting married. Oh, how wonderful, Pauline exclaimed, and the other women chorused their congratulations. We're not invited, Margaret added quietly. The room fell silent. Margaret could feel their eyes on her, their mixture of shock and sympathy, and was that judgment? She suddenly couldn't bear to be there. I'm sorry, I have to go. She gathered her things quickly, ignoring their protests and questions, and fled to her car. Sitting in the driver's seat, Margaret called the one person who might understand, her sister, Catherine, who lived in Scotland. Maggie, Catherine answered on the third ring. This is a surprise, everything all right? And suddenly, it all came pouring out. The confrontation with Emma, the accusations of control and judgment, the wedding invitation that would never come. Margaret sobbed into the phone, her carefully maintained composure finally crumbling completely. Catherine listened without interruption until Margaret had exhausted herself. Then, in her typically blunt way, she said, Well, you did rather bring this on yourself. Catherine, I'm sorry, love, but it's true. You've been managing Emma's life since she was born. Everything had to be perfect, everything had to be proper. I've watched you criticize that girl's choices for years. I was helping her, Margaret protested weakly. Were you, or were you trying to live vicariously through her to make sure she achieved everything you didn't? The words hit Margaret like a physical blow. She sat in the car, the phone pressed to her ear, as Catherine's observations settled over her like a cold blanket. I wanted her to have opportunities, Margaret whispered. I know you did, but somewhere along the way you forgot to let her choose which opportunities she actually wanted. Maggie, do you even know what makes Emma happy? Not what you think should make her happy, but what actually does. Margaret tried to answer and realized with dawning horror that she couldn't. She knew Emma was good at law, but did Emma enjoy it? She knew Emma lived with Bradley, but what did they do together? What were Emma's hobbies, her dreams, her fears? Oh God, Catherine, what have I done? You've loved your daughter the only way you knew how, Catherine said, her voice gentler now. But that doesn't mean it was the right way. The question is, what are you going to do now? That evening, when Thomas finally emerged from his study, Margaret was waiting in the kitchen with tea and a quiet determination. We need to talk, she said. Thomas sighed heavily and sat down. If this is about Emma. It is, Thomas, we need to really look at what happened, not just react with hurt pride, but truly examine our part in this. Our part, Thomas's voice was sharp. Margaret, Emma is throwing us out of her life. We've done nothing but love and support her, and this is how she repays us. Have we, though, really supported her? Margaret wrapped her hands around her teacup. Or have we supported the version of Emma we wanted her to be? That's nonsense. We've always wanted what's best for her. What we thought was best, not what she wanted. Margaret met her husband's eyes. Thomas, when was the last time we asked Emma what she wanted and actually listened to her answer without offering our opinion? Thomas was quiet for a long moment. She's making a mistake with this Bradley fellow. Why? Because he's a plumber, because he didn't go to university, because he doesn't speak like we do. Because he's not good enough for her. According to whom? Margaret felt a surge of frustration. Thomas, I've been thinking about this all day. Emma is 28 years old. She has a good career, a nice home, and apparently a partner who supports her enough to stand by her side when she confronts her own parents. Maybe Bradley is exactly what she needs, someone who values her for who she is, not who he wants her to be. Thomas stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. I don't understand why you're suddenly taking their side. I'm not taking sides, I'm trying to understand how we got here. Margaret felt tears threatening again. Thomas, we're losing our daughter, doesn't that terrify you? His shoulders sagged slightly, and for a moment his carefully maintained facade cracked. Of course it does, but what can we do? We can't force Emma to want us in her life. No, but we can try to understand why she doesn't. Margaret stood and moved to her husband, taking his hands. We can try to change. Change how? Apparently everything we've done is wrong. Not everything, but maybe we have been too controlling, too critical. I spoke with Catherine today and she said something that struck me. She asked if I even knew what made Emma happy. And do you? Margaret shook her head. I realized I don't, not really. I know what I think should make her happy, but that's not the same thing, is it? Thomas was silent and Margaret could see him wrestling with the same realization. Finally, he said quietly, I thought I was protecting her, guiding her away from mistakes. I know, so did I, but in doing that, we never let her make her own choices, and we certainly never let her make her own mistakes. They stood together in the kitchen, the weight of their revelations settling between them. Outside, the autumn wind rattled the windows, and Margaret thought about Emma in her London flat, probably feeling relief now that the confrontation was over, probably planning a wedding that her parents wouldn't attend. So what do we do? Thomas asked finally. Margaret took a deep breath. I think we need to respect Emma's wishes, and I think we need to cancel the wedding. Cancel what wedding? We're not invited, remember. The wedding we were planning, Margaret clarified. I know Emma didn't ask us directly, but I'd already spoken with the caterers, made inquiries at the country club, contacted my dressmaker. I was planning a wedding in my head, the wedding I wanted her to have. And I was going to present it to her as a gift, as if I knew better what she wanted than she did herself. Thomas looked at her in surprise. You were doing all that? Yes, it's exactly what Emma was talking about. I couldn't help myself. Even after she told us to back off, I was still trying to control her wedding. Margaret laughed bitterly. No wonder she doesn't want us there. What about the money we'd set aside? We send it to her with no strings attached. We tell her to use it however she wants for the wedding or not use it at all. It's her choice. Thomas ran a hand through his thinning hair, looking older and more vulnerable than Margaret had seen him in years. I don't know if I can do this, Margaret. Stand back and watch her make her own decisions, possibly mistakes. We have to. It's the only way we might eventually repair this relationship. Margaret squeezed his hands. Thomas, think about it. When did we become the kind of parents our daughter would rather marry without than try to please? The question hung in the air, unanswered and unanswerable. The next morning, Margaret sat at her desk with pen and paper. She'd always preferred handwritten letters for important correspondence, finding something more personal and thoughtful in the physical act of writing. Now she needed to find the right words for perhaps the most important letter of her life. Dearest Emma, your father and I have spent the past few days reflecting on our conversation at your flat. I won't pretend it wasn't painful to hear how we've made you feel, but I'm grateful you were honest with us, even though we didn't react well in the moment. I've come to realize that I've spent so much time trying to be the perfect mother that I forgot to simply be your mother. I wanted to give you all the opportunities I never had to help you avoid the mistakes I made. But in doing so, I never stopped to ask what you actually wanted. I was planning a wedding for you, Emma. Without your input, without your permission, I was already calling vendors and making arrangements for the wedding I thought you should have. I'm canceling everything today. This is your wedding, your life, and you should have it exactly as you choose. Your father and I respect your decision not to invite us to the ceremony. While it breaks our hearts, we understand that you need space to build your life with Bradley on your own terms. We want you to know that we're sending you the money we'd set aside for the wedding, no strings attached. Use it however you wish for the wedding, for a honeymoon, for your home, or don't use it at all. The choice is entirely yours. I can't promise we'll suddenly become perfect, unintrusive parents. Old habits are hard to break, but I can promise that we'll try to listen more and advise less. We'll work on respecting your boundaries and your choices. If in the future you decide you want us to be part of your life again, we'll be here. And if you don't, we'll respect that too, though it will be the hardest thing we've ever done. Know that we love you, Emma. Not the version of you we tried to create, but you exactly as you are and whoever you choose to be. All our love. Mum and Dad. Margaret folded the letter carefully and placed it in an envelope. Then she sat at her computer and began canceling appointments with vendors, sending polite emails explaining that the wedding had been called off. With each cancellation, she felt a strange mixture of loss and relief, loss for the event she'd imagined, relief at finally letting go of control. Thomas found her there several hours later, surrounded by printed emails and crossed-off lists. "Is it done?" he asked. "Most of it. I'll need to make a few more phone calls tomorrow." Margaret looked up at him. "I've written to Emma. Do you want to add anything?" He took the letter, read it slowly, and for a moment Margaret thought she saw his eyes glisten. "It's perfect," he said quietly, "though perhaps we should add a bit more about Bradley." Together they composed a postscript. "P.S. We owe Bradley an apology as well. We never gave him a fair chance, judged him on circumstances rather than character. If he makes you happy, Emma, then we're grateful you found him." They posted the letter that afternoon and heard nothing back for 3 agonizing weeks. Margaret found herself checking her phone constantly, jumping every time it rang, hopping for Emma's name to appear. Thomas remained stoic, but she noticed him lingering near the phone in the evenings, watching the screen. Life continued its mundane march forward. Margaret went to her committee meetings, Thomas went to work, and they both tried not to think constantly about their daughter. But the house felt emptier somehow, as if Emma's absence had created a void that no amount of busy activity could fill. Then, on a gray November afternoon, Margaret's phone finally buzzed with a text from Emma. "Can we meet, just the 3 of us?" Margaret's hands trembled as she showed Thomas the message. They agreed immediately, suggesting a quiet cafe halfway between Hampshire and London, neutral territory where no one would feel ambushed. Emma was already there when they arrived, sitting at a corner table with a cup of tea cooling in front of her. She looked tired, Margaret noted, and thinner than she'd been 3 weeks ago. But there was also something different in her expression, less defensive, perhaps, less like a person braced for attack. "Thank you for coming," Emma said as they sat down. "Thank you for asking us," Margaret replied carefully. They ordered tea and sat in awkward silence for a moment. Finally, Emma spoke. "I got your letter and the check," she paused. "I wasn't expecting that." "We meant what we said," Thomas told her. "It's your wedding, your money to use as you choose." "I appreciate that, truly." Emma looked down at her tea. "I've been doing a lot of thinking too, about everything. I may have been harsh in some of what I said." "You were honest," Margaret interjected gently. "That's not the same as harsh." Emma's eyes met hers, surprised. "I thought you'd be angry about the things I said." "Oh, we were," Thomas admitted. "Initially hurt and angry and defensive, but once we got past that we realized you were right about a lot of things." "Not everything," Margaret added. "I still think we've loved you in the best way we knew how, but I can see now that love expressed through control isn't really love at all, it's fear." "Fear of what?" Emma asked. "Fear that you'd make mistakes, fear that you'd be hurt or disappointed or would fail, fear that we'd lose you," Margaret felt her voice catch. "And in trying to prevent all of that, we pushed you away anyway." Emma's eyes glistened. "I'm scared too, you know, scared of repeating patterns, of becoming so focused on pleasing you that I lose myself. That's why I had to be so firm about boundaries." "We understand," Thomas said, "and we want you to know that we'll respect those boundaries, even when it's difficult for us." They talked for over an hour, carefully navigating topics that had been minefields just weeks before. Margaret asked about Bradley, really asked, wanting to know about him as a person rather than as a deviation from her expectations. Emma talked about his kindness, his humor, the way he encouraged her to pursue her interests even when they weren't practical or profitable. "He wants me to take a pottery class," Emma said with a small smile. "Says I light up whenever I talk about working with my hands. He doesn't care that it's frivolous." "It's not frivolous if it makes you happy," Margaret said and meant it. "Will you tell me about it after you've gone a few times?" Emma nodded, visibly surprised. "I'd like that." As they prepared to leave, Emma said hesitantly, "The wedding is in 6 weeks. Small ceremony just at the registry office, then dinner with friends at a restaurant afterward." Margaret and Thomas nodded, preparing for disappointment. "Bradley and I have been talking," Emma continued. "And if you'd like to come just to the ceremony at the registry office, we'd like you to be there." Margaret felt tears spring to her eyes. "Emma, are you sure?" "I'm sure that I want to try." Emma reached across the table and took her mother's hand. "I can't promise everything will be perfect or easy. We're probably going to mess this up sometimes, all of us. But I want to try to have a relationship with you both. a real one based on who we actually are rather than who we think we should be. Thomas cleared his throat roughly. We'd be honored to attend, and we promise. No promises about being perfect, Emma interrupted. Just promise you'll try, that's all any of us can do. 6 weeks later, on a crisp December morning, Margaret and Thomas stood outside a registry office in London. Margaret wore a simple gray dress, not the elaborate mother-of-the-bride gown she'd once imagined, but something understated and appropriate. Thomas looked uncomfortable in his suit, clearly nervous about whether they were truly welcome or just being tolerated. But when Emma emerged from a car, radiant in a knee-length white dress with wildflowers in her hair, and her face lit up at seeing them there, Margaret knew they'd made the right choice in stepping back. The ceremony was brief and informal, nothing like the elaborate affair Margaret had once envisioned. But watching Emma and Bradley exchange vows, simple, heartfelt promises to support each other and grow together, Margaret found herself crying genuine happy tears for perhaps the first time in months. Afterward, Emma hugged them both. "Thank you for respecting my choices," she whispered to Margaret. "That means more than you know." They weren't invited to the dinner with friends, and that was all right. This was Emma's day, Emma's life, and Margaret was learning to be grateful for what she was given rather than resentful of what she wasn't. The drive home that evening felt different from the silent, painful journey of 2 months prior. Thomas held Margaret's hand across the center console, and they talked quietly about the ceremony, about how happy Emma had looked, about the genuine affection obvious between her and Bradley. "We've got a lot of work to do," Thomas said, "learning to let go, learning to listen." "We do," Margaret agreed, "but at least we get to do that work. We could have lost her entirely." "We did lose her," Thomas pointed out, "for a while, and it was the wake-up call we needed." Margaret thought about that, about how sometimes you have to lose something to understand its true value, to recognize how you've been taking it for granted. She thought about all the advice she'd never given Emma, all the criticism she'd bitten back, all the times over the past 6 weeks when she'd wanted to call with a suggestion and had instead sent a simple thinking of you text. It was hard, this new way of loving, harder than she'd expected, but it was also more honest, more real, more respectful of the person Emma actually was. When they arrived home, Margaret noticed a package on the doorstep. Inside was a framed photograph from the wedding, Emma and Bradley in the registry office with Margaret and Thomas standing beside them, all four smiling genuinely. On the back, in Emma's handwriting, it said, "Thank you for being there. Love always, Emma and Bradley." Margaret placed the photo on the mantel, next to other family pictures that charted Emma's life from babyhood to now. Looking at them all together, she could see the story they told, of a child raised with perhaps too much care and not enough trust, of parents who loved deeply but not always wisely, of a young woman finding her own way despite or perhaps because of the obstacles. It wasn't the story Margaret had planned to tell, but it was real and honest and still being written. And that, she was learning, was enough.